I'm Master Saturn. Thank you for joining me for another BDSM United podcast in our Kink Ethics 101 series, where we're trying to look at ethics and learn about ethics so that we can apply it to our kinky play, our BDSM relationships, and really our culture and our community as a whole. We've been looking at five different schools of philosophical and ethical thought that sprung up after that initial Greek foundation of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. We looked at in our most recent past podcast, we looked at the cynics and the skeptics. Today, we want to look at the Epicureans. Today, the word Epicurean has come to be associated with luxurious living and people who take pleasure in cooking and eating. This is because eating well is pleasurable. In classical reasoning, an Epicurean was someone who equated anything pleasurable with being good. Conversely, what's painful is objectively bad for an Epicurean. Therefore, bad things should be eliminated. Things that feel good should be pursued, and happiness is obtained through seeking of pleasure. This was the philosophy of the Epicureans, and I think that we see that as people today who consider themselves hedonists. We find them within our kinky social spaces, people who identify as a hedonist, a seeker of pleasure, a seeker of things that they specifically find pleasurable. Epicureanism was the contrast to the skeptic view. Uh, Epicurus, like Socrates and Plato, thought that man should arrive toward happiness, or should strive toward happiness. He also taught that people should not fear death, they shouldn't fear the gods, and they should seek pleasure in this life as opposed to seeking austerity in the hopes of earning a pleasant afterlife. And I think this is a noble pursuit here because a lot of times we try to kick the can down the road and we try to we do things in this life for an afterlife that is hypothetical in a lot of ways. It's something that none of us have ultimately experienced, and we are really unsure or undecided what virtues enable us to have this hypothetical afterlife. And so in some ways we should seek, at least we should be seeking more pleasure in this life than hoping of earning an afterlife. Because pleasure is the main emphasis of life, Epicureanism, by its nature, is a hedonistic philosophy, or one that is pleasure based. However, Epicureans went beyond that simple recommendation to also emphasize the importance of avoiding pleasures that may cause harm in the future. And to them, that was the virtue of temperance. Now, Epicurus was harshly critical of other philosophers and philosophies. He thought the cynics were dangerous and potentially were the enemies of the state. Of his 300 works, only 3 of his letters have survived. And these surviving works, however, really effectively summarize his philosophy. In them, he linked morality to pleasure and noted that the goal of life is to minimize pain and maximize pleasure. He wrote that pleasure is the beginning and end of the good life. We recognize pleasure as the first good, being natural to us, and it is from pleasure that we begin every choice and every avoidance. It's also to pleasure that we return, using it as a standard by which we judge every good thing. Now, the difficulty in this approach is figuring out the types of pleasures that actually lead to human happiness. because what is pleasurable for me, if I found killing people to be pleasurable, it's not necessarily going to lead to the happiness of the people that I were to kill. Using that as an example, because I don't find killing people pleasurable. Uh, just to throw that out there. But Epicurus's first step in the quest for happiness and pleasurable life was to eliminate pain as much as possible. And he upheld that one major source of fear is religious myth. And that fear is experienced when people worry about how gods view them and if gods are about to deliver punishment or reward. Now, remember, Epicurus wasn't really influenced by Christianity. This was before Christianity, but there was, the world was mostly polytheistic at this point, and at least his world. And so there were a number of gods, and they were all working towards their own goals, their own aims, and oftentimes people were worried or had to worry about appeasing multiple gods on multiple levels. And so, sometimes being a polyamorous person, people will sometimes say, how do you deal with more than one partner? Isn't that complicated? And yes and no, it can be increasingly complicated, and in that way, being polytheistic, having to deal with multiple gods instead of just one, adds a certain level of difficulty to your life. Is it worth it? I'm not sure. Is it worth it? I'm on the polytheistic level. Is it worth it polyamorously? Definitely. It's definitely the extra difficulties that I experience I find are worth it to be in the multiple relationships that I'm in. They are worth any difficulties that they bring to me. So I think in somebody who's from a polytheistic religion, possibly it's worth it because they have more people advocating for them, and more people more gods advocating for them, more gods that are that they can appease and manipulate or use or utilize, more gods to influence the world around them. So possibly for them. But for Epicurus, no. He did not find polytheism beneficial and said that he pursued his own pleasure and that we shouldn't worry about the fear of gods, because he argued that these fears are unfounded. Indeed, we are freed from the fear of gods because the gods themselves have nothing to do with human affairs. Natural events such as lightning and earthquakes, for example, according to Epicurus, are entirely the result of the configuration of atoms, and they're not caused by the will of the gods. Now, this was revolutionary thinking for this period of Greek history. Epicurus did not outright deny the existence of the gods, but he did say that they are entirely different than how people commonly imagine them, and that science and faith, they can live side by side, but with some adjustments. Another fear that leads to pain is the fear of death, and Epicurus had a solution for this: never die. No, I'm just joking. He counseled that death need not be feared because the world is wholly material. As such, the soul doesn't survive death, and that in turn means a person cannot experience pain after death. So basically, he's saying that we shouldn't fear death because there's nothing after death. It's cold comfort, but it's logical, according to Epicurus. Now, Epicurus did qualify all of this into finding the right pleasures. He reasoned that to find happiness, we must figure out the pleasures that are best for us. Here's the kind of the sticky point, because who gets to decide that? Now, we're human and humans have desires, and some of these desires lead to real happiness, while others lead to pleasure, more immediate pleasure, but then ultimately pain. He described this by breaking down our desires into three levels. The first level are desires that are necessary things like basic food and shelter. He said to pursue these desires. The next level of desires are nicer versions of these basic needs, things like rich food and big houses, for example. Epicurus found these problematic because we can't always get them. And if we can't, perhaps that might frustrate us. And the third level of desires are those that are vain and empty, like wealth, fame, and power. And these desires can't be satisfied simply because they are limitless. If we get them, we always want more, and we will never be happy with enough of them. These desires, according to Epicurus, should not be pursued. So, what's the trick then? Well, temperance, or pleasure through moderation. Simple pleasures lead to the most happiness and the least pain, while pleasures with an edge will come back to cut you. Take getting drunk, for example. It may be fun in the moment, but possibly a hangover or an addiction or dependency may result. Temperance leads naturally to happiness because it encourages us to develop virtues or good habits. And these good habits will lead to good choices in seeking out the best kinds of pleasure that deliver the least amount of pain. Epicurus recommended the usual ancient Greek virtues of courage, honor, justice, and moderation, but he added another one, prudence, or the ability to make decisions about one's own interests and then to act accordingly in a healthy manner. So definitely want to add this to our tool belt, our ethical tool belt. We added the cynics and the skeptics, and definitely didn't want to take them to the extreme. Don't necessarily want to take Epicureanism to the extreme either, because we know that within kink and BDSM that sometimes pain can be pleasurable, and so avoiding pain at all costs is not necessarily our goal. Giving good, pleasurable pain is oftentimes my personal goal as a sadist. And so definitely want to add it to your tool belt, add these ideas, but then, take what's profitable and leave the rest behind. I'm Master Saturn. Thank you for joining me for this podcast. You can find all of the previous ones in this series at our website, bdsmunited.com. You can also find our uncensored social space at mastersaturn.com. And it was a joy speaking with you today on this Kink Ethics 101 series. In our next podcast, we'll look at another one of these 5 schools. And as we kind of work through history, the history of ethics, ultimately trying to build our own ethics that we can utilize and use in our kinky play and our BDSM relationships and within our BDSM culture. You make up our culture. You make up our community. And so you being educated on ethics is important to having a good community, having a good culture. And so we believe that when adults are educated, it's better for everyone, and it's better for us as a BDSM community. It was a joy speaking with you today, and I'll talk with you again soon.